Mark A. Altman. DAREN DOCHTERMAN. Ashley Edward Miller. Three fans who became professionals and then became Treksperts. Inglorious Treksperts. Listen wherever you find podcasts or go to trekspertsplus.com.
Hey, this is Mark A. Altman.
And this is DAREN DOCHTERMAN, and we are the Inglorious
Treksperts. And this is the one you've been waiting for. We've talked about it. We've promoted it. We promised it. And now it's here. The thriller in Mutara. What? The thriller in Mutara Nebula. In one corner. I know there's no Mutara Nebula in Star Trek 2, but it rhymes with Manila, sort of.
Oh,
So
Doesn't.
okay. Ashley Miller is here. Ashley Miller and myself will be the arbiters of this, much like Yarnek in the Savage Curtain. We will determine if good or evil is triumphant. We will listen to the arguments.
There's no good and evil. There are merely viewpoints.
Well, we'll see from a certain point of view. Wrong franchise. Okay. This is how it's going to work. In one corner, standing at 5'9", it's the concept designer of Master and Commander.
I'm 5'10", mister.
In one corner, standing at 5'10", it's the concept designer of Master and Commander, visual effects supervisor of Star Trek, the motion picture director's edition, and co-host of Inglorious Treksperts, DAREN R. Doctorman.
Thank you. Please.
And in the other corner, towering at 6'1" or something like that, is the longtime sci-fi aficionado, genre enthusiast, frequent Inglorious Treksperts guest, and the president of 20th Century Studios, and the president of 20th Century Studios, Mr. Steve Asbell. Welcome, Steve.
What are we doing here?
I want to see a good, clean fight. Each of you will have an opening statement, which will be followed by the following categories. After a 5-minute debate, Ashley and I will be able to ask questions, and we will evaluate on each category. And at the end, we will add that and we'll determine who the winner is. Ashley and I are going to be completely impartial. We're going to forget what we know or don't know about Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country. We're going to be a tabula rasa, listening to the wisdom that both of you share with us. And whoever makes the best argument is the winner. We are not recusing ourselves. We couldn't find anybody who hadn't seen the movie to listen to the arguments. And this is how it's going to work. We'll have 5 minutes for opening statements. We will then talk story and dialogue, characterization and acting, allegory and metaphor. Only Nixon could go to China. Action, production design, visual effects and makeup, fonts, and finally closing statements. And then we will determine if it's thumbs up for Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country, or thumbs down.
Wow. No pressure. I was going to say I should have studied.
You
In
studied.
the original Klingon. Yes.
This is what you get for missing staff meetings, Steve.
Well, I thank you first of all for that very kind introduction. I will say I'm here. You know, they say at the beginning of the DVD, the views herein do not represent the views of the company. This is not. I come here. I come here in peace, and you blatantly defile that. No, I come here as a fan and as an aficionado of Star Trek, but also a great fan of your podcast and this show and how much I love it. Nothing to do with my job at the movie studio, the other movie studio. And the other thing I wanted to say is just I actually very much, I've told this to you guys personally, but I wanted to say it publicly. I really enjoyed the Star Trek 3 commentary that you guys did with Rob Burnett. And I think I want to say it out loud because I think there's some suspicion that I might not, being generally on the pro side of the film. You guys were on the pro side of the film too, to be clear.
Yeah.
You were I think made the case extremely well of that did not come from a dislike of the movie. But I will say I found it interesting, and there were a lot of ideas that I thought were quite provocative, and things that made me want, think about, well, what could you have done? Starting to do that thing. Like, if we just redid some of it, what would that be like? Because I think there are two for me, and I won't go on about this, but I think there are two ways I look at this stuff, and it's a little bit relevant to the conversation today. One for me is the context of when I saw it, right? We all kind of came to it at different times. For me, as I've said to you guys, I really started with the TOS movie, so the cast of the movies, and I sort of discovered the shows later on. And so coming from Wrath of Khan into 1984, and I was 10 years old, and I just loved them so much, and I was so caught up in the drama of the sacrifice and what they would do for their friends and sacrificing the ship. And so it was really impactful to me. And of course, years later, being able to sort of look back at it in the context of, what about it doesn't work so well? But that leads me to the second thing, which is something you guys do so well on the show, giving context for when the movie was made and what kinds of things, led to a movie. You guys did actually quite well in the in the TNG seasons 1 and 2 episodes, because it's so important. And I think for younger folks finding this stuff on Netflix and kind of getting into Star Trek, which is so vast. I mean, we've talked about 50 years of stuff, like of different interpretations but understanding what was going on when this stuff was made is actually, I find, really interesting. Like going back and like, well, what was going on? Harv writing the script, Harv, Paramount keeping it in the television department, Leonard coming on as a director as a way of getting him in the movie, and them having to put those kinds of limitations on him. I mean, I think appropriately, but I mean, ultimately all the ways in which it came together. And that you had something you guys mentioned the other day about, in one of the episodes, about DeForest Kelley having some hesitations about the script, and how it couldn't have the sort of movie wasn't put together in a way where everybody had been like, no, it's not good enough. We have to make it better. We have to make, they couldn't do it with Leonard. They had to get it done by a certain time. And I'm sure the studio was like, it's going through the TV division. Here's the budget. And it definitely impacted all the things you guys talked about in the episode. So I was just really, I was really cool until you guys started talking about the Excelsior being bad. Then I lost it. But
well, first I want to say, based on what you said, thank you, and you win, so we don't have to do the debate now. No, but we're completely impartial. And the other thing I want to say is it's really interesting. You touched on something that we don't really talk about, which is the idea that actors are paid to do a job, and to their credit, they do their best to actors of a certain stature will give their input, but generally they will say the lines. There's not it doesn't happen very often, which I'm not going to say this, I'm not going to do this. Once they've taken the check, they're gonna do the movie. And a lot of times they know the movie is not good, but part of their job is to go out and red carpet and promote it. Yeah. So when we have people saying, oh, you were so disrespectful, and then you have somebody like Eddie Egan, who is the unit publicist on the movie, calling and saying, well, D. Kelly really didn't like the movie, but he's such a pro, he extols its virtues. It's like exactly the point. I mean, there's stuff I could tell you about the JJ movies and the actors, which I'm not going to share on this podcast because I've been told it in confidence, but where you'd be surprised at what they really think about these movies, despite whatever they may be saying on the websites and their interviews.
Also, I think you pointed out too that Dee did a really good job with his part in that movie. Yeah. He actually brings, I think, some real. He was in it. I mean, he brings some gravitas and some humor, and I mean, he was sort of out of it for a lot, just by necessity of the plot. Right. But I think just all the ways in which movies get made and why, and what the director brings or doesn't bring to it, and how we all love Leonard. It's not the question of not loving him or honoring his memory.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
As Spock, but also as a filmmaker, as a creator, as a really critical part of what made that show great from 50 years ago. And I would argue, we can talk about it, we talk about it before, but 3 Men and a Baby, he had some real comedic, developed into sort of some comedic technique for sure in his directing. But I think the combination of, I always feel like in art, when I do it and you guys do it too, it's like, if you see a movie, when you kind of look back and you say, okay, none of those elements that went into it, the script we thought was okay, or the director, it was their first time doing it, and we thought, okay, we're going to put somebody around him or her, and we're going to put, what was that thing? We're going to put him with the best DP, or we're going to put him, and it's just, and you can look back and say, well, none of those decisions were good enough. Meaning there's not one piece that meant like, it's going to pop. Something about it is going to be better than the individual piece, or some piece is you can point to and say, that's great. And I think you can look at 3 and say, in that way, because of where they were and what hard writing the script, even, you're just like, okay, well, that's a choice, I guess, or it's certainly not that there wasn't value to it, but rather certainly after 2, was it the best it could be? Was it held to a higher standard? And I think you can, everybody, it's hard enough to make these things come out making sense, much less being any good all the time. You can have all the great, you guys talk about it, you all know it, all the right elements, and the souffle still doesn't rise. It just happens. Yeah. But I do think, having looked back, like, you can always sort of say, well, there were enough of those ingredients that were not quite up to what we would want to say were, especially after you'd seen both Robert Wise and Nick Meyer in their sort of very different interpretations and budgets and all the ways in which, I know that Nick and everybody gets a lot of credit, and rightly, for 2, but I think if you just looked at motion picture and con together, it's a pretty phenomenal poles, kind of ends of the spectrum of what you could do with Star Trek. And I think it just, doesn't seem to be have been enough interest in elevating it. Like, I think they just thought we got away with it and it was good. And
the good news is they're not going to prosecute,
because we got Harv, and again, it's hard because I do love the movie in a way, but it definitely, that's all I can say is
that's the point. So do we.
The episode, the commentary really made me think about, I think, those issues in ways that I think I'd like, just liking the movie had precluded me from really thinking about. So anyway.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I will say that, you do see later on, after, the disappointment of Star Trek 3 and the success of Star Trek 4, where the actors are more willing to push back, because Dee did push back on Star Trek 5. Mm-hmm. And I think that scene is better for it. And again, despite whatever reservations he had, he gives 100%, and he's great in Star Trek 5. Same thing with Leonard. Leonard had a lot of trepidation about Star Trek 5, but no one would say that Leonard is the weak link in Star Trek 5.
Right.
So, the actors, will do that. And, unfortunately, you start to get, this is a whole nother conversation.
Yeah,
the actors get enough power where they can start to change things. And so you look at something like Generations, which is not true to the characters, it's true to the actors,
right.
And you have my family line died in a fire, and then Captain Kirk cooking in a log cabin with his horses and his dog Buster. So anyway, with that, we're going to be covering Generations soon as well. But today it's all about Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country, the last of the classic Star Trek films, directed by Nick Meyer, shepherded to the screen by producer Leonard Nimoy and Stephen Charles Jaffe, who focused more, I think, as line producer on that.
And Ralph.
And of course, the great Ralph Winter, a previous guest on the show, who did a fantastic job with very limited resources. I want to put it in some context before we begin, which of course is the fact that this was produced for the 25th anniversary year of Star Trek. And it was very close to the actual anniversary when Paramount greenlit the movie. It had been put into pre-production. The studio was concerned about the budget after the reception of Star Trek 5. The plug was kind of pulled. They cut the budget. It went back and it got made by the grace of God. It managed to make make screening date. Gene Roddenberry died only a few days before the film was released in theaters. A card was added dedicated to Gene Roddenberry. And that is the world in which this movie was released.
Can I ask one question about that? Because just there was the Harv Academy, Starfleet Academy version, right? I mean, wasn't that true that that was part of the Rift?
Yeah, well, that was why Harv did not come back for Star Trek VI, because he not only was supposed to direct the Academy years, but he was going to produce it. And he was willing to give up directing it to save the movie. But the new administration, I think it was Frank Mancuso, came aboard at Paramount and said, what the hell? This doesn't even have Kirk and Spock in it. They added them as bookends, introducing the story, and then as the outro, giving the commencement speech at Starfleet Academy. And he was like, "No, we're not doing this. I want a last original cast movie." And they went into it with the idea that, oh, this will be a marketing slam dunk, the final voyage of the Starship Enterprise, but not like in Star Trek 3. I mean, literally, this would be the last thing with the cast. And by then, Next Generation was doing well enough that they knew the next film would either be a bridge film, a handover, or would be, a Next Generation film. And of course, because even then there was still a lot of drama between the two casts. People forget, the original narration at the end of the movie was, to the next generation, do we leave our, whatever the whole speech is. And somebody said something about, oh, the next film is going to be a Next Generation film. This is the last of the original. And Nimoy took it as an affront and had the narration changed. So they no longer said Next Generation. They said to future crews. So even then there was so much politics, and, so many people, having to parse their words and be political and Next Generation.
Didn't Michael Dorn say he had a good time on the set?
Michael Dorn had a great time.
You know what? Michael Dorn would have a great time anywhere. That guy.
I just mean there was no just interesting, like all of this context of him appearing in the movie.
He was there for a day. Why wouldn't he have a great time?
Well, and he was a super fan. Look, I mean, when he was on the podcast, he talked about going to see Star Trek the Motion Picture for the first time on a date. Like that. So he was a genuine Star Trek fan. So he said being around these people he grew up on, before he was even an actor, when he was going on dates in Pasadena, was very exciting for him. I think who could care less. It would just be a job, right? But for him, it meant a lot to be around Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and the classic Klingons and all that kind of stuff. So that was really, really interesting. But okay, that's the context in which we begin our great debate, the great battle, the thriller. So
we fight to end battles,
but
not to win battles. I screwed it up. I was gonna. Sorry.
Steve is with the pro. Darren is with the con. CON, not KHAN. And we did a coin flip before the broadcast began. So we determined, Darren, you get to choose if you want to make your opening statement first or second.
I give that honor to Mr. Asbell, please.
Okay.
Most kind. Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. I saw when it was December 6, 1991. I was 16, 17. Went right after school. In fact, cut the last class with my good friend at the time, who was still a good friend, but big sort of Star Trek fans. Drove straight to the theater and watched it, and then watched it again. Called my parents and said, "Oh, we're going to eat dinner here," and just watched it again. And I have always been fond of this movie, in part because it represents, to an extent, what I have loved about what the movies do, which is some sort of passing of time, some sense that these characters who we love kind of are aging in a way. It certainly was not done in the original series. They couldn't, of course. I just mean that the movies did it at a time where they were, even when you were out of the 2, 3, 4 series, it touched on them as characters who were passing through time in the same way. It's a funny thing when you think about Last Crusade, a movie that Indiana Jones was never really about that. In fact, it went, 1936 to 35 to 38, but that this idea that it was also 10 years of your young life, you sort of felt like they were progressing. And I think the notion that that Nick had come back, I guess I'm speaking of it more when I saw it, but also what I still really love about the film, which is that I loved their performances in it. And I think in the sense that they were at least able to embrace age in a sense. And even when I remember seeing William Shatner, he's like, he had gray hair, it's like, holy shit, like they're going for it, that there was really this sort of, this was it. This was the end of the line for them. But I also liked, I think even then, that it felt like it was getting back to something with Star Trek, which hadn't been done before in the movie series necessarily, but had really tried to talk about events, at least as I obviously wasn't around in the 60s, but that I was always understood that the show had such a great an important connection to world events, to what was going on in the world, even though it was Wagon Train to the Stars, that's what gave it some grounding, that there were real current relatable themes that were going on with Star Trek. And while it was a different experience seeing it as a film versus what the series was doing, and again, the series was groundbreaking in its time because there's nothing else like it or since, frankly, in terms of what it did. But the idea that Star Trek was going to kind of come back in a way and try to comment on, in this case, pretty literally and directly, something that was happening, not only in terms of the fall of the Soviet Union, but also the idea of what was happening, the notion of assassination, of political assassination, Gandhi, with things that we've been living with, I think more and more in our sort of modern era, of what happens to the peacemakers, who kind of run afoul of countervailing interests, and the tragedy of that. So there were all of these very, even as a 17-year-old or whatever, contemporary themes that were embedded in this story, which was also, I thought, sort of paced pretty well, had a really interesting balance of sort of ship the stuff I loved about Star Trek, which is ranging from the uniforms to the Enterprise to all the stuff going on the bridge, but then on Rurapente, I mean, there was a really interesting journey on which I don't think the other movies had done as I don't say as boldly. I mean, again, this goes back to Star Trek 3. They went to a planet, but it's the idea that there was a real both local conflict, but also a sort of appropriately galactic one, and that sort of it all culminated in the Kittimer sequence and having to stop the assassination of Kurtwood Smith. But also, and I think this is probably the part that we may disagree on the most, was the idea that like it took a risk with these characters in the sense that it was riding a line, and occasionally I think not crossed it. I think it's something Nick Meyer sometimes overdoes in the movie, in his pursuit to be literal. I mean, there's Nixon Go to China, which is funny, and the original Shakespeare and the original Klingon, but then there's the things that's got to have a tailpipe, that there was the idea of saying that these characters were not themselves inherently bigoted, but that they were of a generation, which I think you can see in people that you love and parents who sort of were otherwise upstanding, non-bigoted people who are products of a generation that don't know how to think of it any other way. And it's one of my favorite lines in the film where Gorkon says to Kirk, if there is to be this, brave new world, our generation is going to have the hardest time living in it. And the companion to that is when he's on the table dying and he grabs Kirk's head and he says, "Don't let it end this way." Like that there was real, I think, pathos to that. And so getting to take a risk with some of these characters, some more than others, to be clear, I think we can get into all of that, but to say that there was a real journey for them of having to confront our own, we like to think of ourselves, and this is, I think, ever more relevant today, as liberal people, as tolerant as it, and yet there are prejudices we may have that we don't confront. And it takes certain kinds of incidents, certain kinds of crucibles to bring that up. Anyway, this is a long opening statement. I apologize.
Okay, we got to move to. Oh,
All
okay. You. That was your 5 minutes. So I got
That was your 10-minute, 5 minutes.
I got to enforce the time equally for both of you. So I can't show any favoritism. So DAREN, now you have your opening statement.
With all due regard to my opponent on the other side of the screen, I think that these points that you come up with are valid. However, I don't think the film fulfills the role that you think that it does. Obviously, we've talked about the genesis of this project was very rushed, and it was replacing a previous idea that had been developed, and the script was written extremely fast from apparently a beach walk between Nick Meyer and Leonard Nimoy, and while the impetus of it is good, it's it's the wall comes down in outer space, fine. The problem is that it takes it far too literally. And all these aspects are like one-to-one relations. There's no allegory in it. There's no depth in it. And the fact that they have to take our main characters and turn them into bigots, basically, and give them that outlook, which is frankly offensive to my sensibilities and my knowledge of specifically Kirk as a character, that Kirk would be at the forefront of celebrating the Klingons and helping the Klingons. He would be out there, finding the truth. He wouldn't be bigoted against them because he's dealt with them more than anyone on the Earth has ever. So his knowledge and personal connection to the Klingon society would be a beacon of light in this story, and it isn't. And that's the greatest failing, I think. And the fact that they have to contrive a conspiracy between, quote, evil Federation people is ludicrous. It's appalling, and it's lazy, and I hate it. And for those reasons, I think that the fact that we could have had an expanding universe and a bigger understanding of what goes into the Klingon culture that maybe the Federation hasn't been told. Maybe the culprit is the lack of knowledge about the Klingon culture. Maybe that's the main problem that we have to fight against. And it's not the, Burke and Somno, the two idiot transporter people that left the boots in the locker. It's just silly. It makes all our characters less so. And frankly, in several of the scenes, the incompetence that the Enterprise crew has to show is appalling. And I hate it on that basis primarily.
Yeah. By the way, I just want to correct the myth, because you mentioned the walk on the beach. What DAREN's referring to, of course, is the famous story where Nick Meyer was invited to talk to Leonard on Cape Cod, and they took a walk, and he said, "What would this be about?" And said, "When the Berlin Wall falls in space, what would that look like?" The funny thing about this story that it didn't happen between them is it didn't really happen, because there was a whole script written by Lawrence Rosenthal and Mark Kohner, which was about this very subject before any of this happened. So this was kind of the myth of the press release, but it wasn't the reality. So it's print the legend in this case.
Right.
Okay.
And they both said it.
Yeah,
they both told that story. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And there's some other interesting stories which I've told on the podcast that I don't want to belabor the point, but how Nick was doing another movie, and he was going to actually turn this movie down, and got convinced by the executive Jeff Kleeman, Jeff Kleeman, because he came to visit him in Massachusetts, Star Trek II happened to be on after Nick turned him down, and they were watching Star Trek II, and Nick started saying, wait a second, oh, that was cool. Oh, I love this. This is really interesting. Oh, maybe I could do it differently this time. And by the end of them watching Star Trek II on ABC or wherever it was airing, Nick had changed his mind, but Nick was still committed to post on another movie. So he hired his assistant, Danny Martin Flynn, to co-write the script with him. And
nobody wants to hear about the executive.
And Danny Martin Flynn, unfortunately, was very ill at the time. He was dying, and Nick wanted to find a way to get him some money, which was so he co-wrote the script with him. So anyway, that's just a little backstory. Steve, you went first last time, so I'm going to give you the choice. Do you want to go first? The next category is story and dialogue. Do you want to go first? Or do you want to give DAREN the chance to go first here?
Well, I have to say I really appreciated and enjoyed actually how DAREN just articulated his opening statement, which was far more eloquent and concise than mine. So I would love to hear him first.
Great. Okay, DAREN, story and dialogue.
All right. I went into a bit about my problems with the story before. I don't think it's a bad idea. In fact, it's the logical continuation of the story of the Klingons and the Federation. So it's a reasonable place to start. But it's handled so clumsily and so on the nose that it's really annoying at times. The dialogue is terrible. The whole scene of the meeting at the Federation headquarters, supposedly, where Spock says, we volunteered to meet the ambassador and the president of the Klingon Council and all that, is so there's no other word for it. It's just on the nose, and there's no subtext at all. It's very clumsy. And why wouldn't Spock have told Kirk about this? I mean, Spock would have. That's the thing. This isn't the characters that they are, in this universe. It's not something that Spock would do an end run around Kirk about. Spock knows the story better than anybody. And I just found that just clumsy, and it's not really important to the story that he's surprising Kirk with this, and it just brings out a very bold statement that Kirk says that Shatner had a big problem with, apparently, the whole speech of "let them die."
Let them die. Well, he wouldn't let him cut.
He wouldn't let him change it.
He asked Nick to
let him continue and let him take it back.
He was really mad about it.
But in the edit, it's all cut off.
Yes, that's what he said. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But it's things like this, and I mentioned before the clumsiness of the characters being forced to be incompetent. It's the new character of Valeris, who is actually Savick. They just couldn't get either of the actors back. To have Savick be the traitor, or one of the traitors, is actually kind of an interesting thing, because we've been with this character for a couple of movies, and it would have been fascinating to see what her motivations actually were. But with Kim Cattrall as Valeris, we have no connection to that, and she is honestly very badly directed. A bunch of her lines have no meaning to us, because it sounds like they have no meaning to her when she says them. It's clunky. There's no other word for it. It's clunky, and the acting is one thing, but the writing is very overly wrought, and there's too much dialogue in it. Because
at least it's not McClunky.
It's not McClunky, yeah. But the other part is that one of the scenes that I find absolutely appalling is when they're trying to communicate with the Klingon outpost. Sure. And they have a bunch of Klingon translation books books. First of all, this is Nick Meyer's his love of the printed word sneaking in yet again, completely inappropriately, and Uhura being out of her element for some reason. This is not what should happen. What should happen is some of her underlings are trying to deal with this situation, and she comes in and she speaks to the Klingon, and she gets them past this situation because she's qualified. She's one of the stars of the movie. She does something that is laudable and heroic, but there's none of that. And it's a horrible oversight, especially for her character, which could have been great. It could have been a wonderful moment for her. But now let's just have a joke with a goofy day player going.
Okay,
it's awful.
And now,
it's awful.
Steve, you can respond, and at the end of the segment, then Ashley, I'll ask you to ask if you have questions you want to follow up on. So now, Steve, how do you respond to Darren?
I think the part that I disagree with, I mean, again, you make very good points about, I think, rooted understandably in your long association and not association, but how you know Kirk
connection
over the course of all of the movies and the shows, and it's sort of I think is part of that. I think where I think the movie was rooted in, and I actually really liked it at the time, and I still do in this regard, is that his reaction about the Klingons was perhaps, whether you could argue it was overly influenced or not, was rooted in the idea that of David's death, which obviously this film makes great hay of. And if you read the J.M. Dillard adaptation, there was a thing with Carol Marcus where she was in the hospital from a Klingon attack, and this idea that there was, but we won't add that into the record.
We need to take that out of the record. That is not canon. That does not count. Well, I need to have it stricken from the transcript.
And I guess you'd have to jettison a little bit of Star Trek V, I suppose, but with the idea that his whatever feelings that he had towards the Klingons from the past were irrevocably changed by his encounter with Kruge and David's death and the senselessness of it. And you had a guy who had never been able to really interrogate that trauma, and it informed, I think, his, at least again in the sort of way the movie is set up, why he would be less tolerant, or certainly less open to this idea, certainly of being the olive branch that he's been made to be. Because I actually think I really like that scene in the boardroom, in part, I mean, even though I love it's a shot, I just love that they make the best use out of these locations, which are basically, what was it? It was I can't remember where it was, but it was like somewhere in Cal Arts or something, right? It was like some gymnasium. But the idea that there was, this sort of Starfleet as this semi-militaristic version, of Starfleet, not just the Federation, but that the whole brass was there, and the CNC walks in and he says, "This is what's going on." And you have Brock Peters, To Kill a Mockingbird, playing, the Cartwright, who's the guy who's like, no freaking way. You have this whole generation of leaders, of battle-hardened admirals and senior officers who would understandably be against this idea, because the notion of what they think the Klingons are is too deeply embedded. And so it sets the story up, I thought, in a really interesting way. As you say, maybe it's a little, it is literal. I will certainly give you that. But it created, I think, a dramatic conflict for these characters that I understood, that it was sort of felt like they were out of they had been outmoded in a sense, and hadn't quite, and they were so close to retirement, which I thought that was an interesting thing. They were 3 months away or whatever it was from I guess they weren't decommissioning the Enterprise. It was like 20, every Enterprise has 20 years, I guess, but that they were, they were on their way out. And so suddenly they sent on this mission, which none of them are comfortable with, because their lived-in experience of having and again, this is the suggestion I think that the movie is making, ostensibly fought a various battles, Cold Wars, you know, the Klingons have always been the enemy, and they've always been, by definition, misunderstood, or not just misunderstood, like there was no interest in understanding them because they were so different from us. One of the things that I think is interestingly distinct from the Cold War Russian-US comparison is the racial element, is this idea that there, which I think is less successful in this movie, candidly, because it seems less interesting to me, and I think sort of sometimes leads to some of the dialogue that I think you're talking about, which is you could sort of do without, in the sense that they were, it's one thing to be xenophobic, I mean, I guess in the political context, right, of your political enemy. It's another thing to be racist about, you know, did you hear the way they smelled or how they ate? Like that part of it, I was, did you, with the two guys, you know, the Burke and Sando make their comments, but even every gag played of, you know, when they're eating and that's gross and all that, like that stuff I certainly grown less. It's like watching Temple of Doom. It's like, there's a lot that you can love and find joy in that movie. There's a lot that you think you can argue is not so great in terms of, not even by contemporary standards, I think by any standards. And so I think they were, as humor goes, I think in this movie, it was the less interesting elements of it. But I think the conflict between kind of Kirk and Chang, I think the idea that you had, you know, all warriors are cold warriors, you do prefer it this way as it was meant to be, you know, that there was this idea that, you know, there was a pull for Kirk to be, you know, that everybody sort of be who you're supposed to be, you know, be your side, we're going to be our side. This is what it is. And I think the fear, and it's fear on both sides. I mean, the which I think was really interesting and sort of politically, I hadn't seen anything like that, certainly before in Star Trek. And I really liked the dinner scene, most of it, whenever David Warner was talking. And sorry,
the reason you haven't seen it in Star Trek before is because it's not Star Trek. That's the reason.
Well, I guess you could say, is it worth then Star Trek being used in a sense as a, is it enough Star Trek that it could still be used as a vehicle for this interesting narrative drama about a guy, first of all, about a group of people who have to kind of sort of come embroiled in this conspiracy, get sent to prison, get rescued, have to, you know, the actual story of them having to manage all of this, I think is interesting. But also, I really just love that how can history get past people like me? And
I think that's great, but if only the characters had actually dealt with that question, and they don't.
Kirk, you don't think Kirk ever deals with it?
No, he's extremely two-dimensional.
When they're in the prison and he says, and again, we can certainly, there are certain scenes we can always say or wish were better, or we can debate whether they're great writing or not, but I really liked that the movie took its time when he and McCoy are in their barracks in the prison, and Kirk's talking about it, and he sort of tells him what was sort of underneath all of this, and basically to his friend, to McCoy, lays his prejudice bare. And it's this going through the crucible of getting almost, you know, sent to this dilithium mine of, you know, basically, you know, he has to confront it. And I think that's actually pretty elegant. Like, I do. I mean, the idea of a character we know has a long history with this particular enemy, this opponent. And in this case, again, it's very much rooted in the idea that he lost his son to this senseless murder by the code, if you will, of one of these Klingons, even though it takes
he was a rogue.
Star Trek 3, I suppose.
Yeah.
Still, I don't care which. And having it to be like that there's some internal conflict to resolve, that in order for the movie to get resolved, and I guess what I'm saying is I think that worked a lot more than it didn't. And I agree with you, just to be clear, I think your point about Uhura's scene is absolutely right. There are moments where Nick's propensity towards the sort of non-start, like the, you know, like my ancestor quoted Arthur Conan Doyle, and this thing's got to have a tailpipe, where there was no regulator on those jokes, and I think it definitely doesn't help the movie.
I agree with your point about Kirk bearing his pain, for lack of a better term, but I just needed more of that. Honestly, I don't remember much of that scene in the prison, and I think that's a problem. Maybe it's my problem, but I just need more of it because I'm stupid that way.
Ashley, do you have questions for our debaters?
I do. So, Mr. Doctorman.
Yes, sir.
And obviously some of this is difficult because we are behaving as though like we're not coming into this with opinions on things. But a lot of your objection, fair or unfair, about the film, I think comes down to, as I am reading your objections, comes down to your interpretation of Captain Kirk, his point of view, what the story of the film should be. What Mr. Asbell is countering with is that what is at the heart of Kirk's story is a very personal feeling about the loss of his son. And I guess my question to you is, if you excise that, if the story is as you would lay out, that it would work for you in the sense of how Kirk would be, what would Kirk's internal conflict be? What would be the thing that actually drives Kirk through the movie other than the plot?
Well, I think the main thing that I think that should be driving Kirk is to defend his ship and crew from being accused of this, and that doesn't really happen. I mean, he's personally responsible for the actions of his crew. Okay, fine, but the fact that no one actually really is seriously investigating this. I mean, they're firing phasers on the ship to, destroy the galley. But it's his motivation is sort of strung along in a lot of sort of unnecessary plot things. I mean, the whole Klingon trial and the prison thing is really kitschy and really sort of cartoony almost. The tone of it is completely different than the rest of the film. And the moment we get into the prison, it becomes like the Star Wars cantina, although done very much worse. Kirk should know how to deal with strange alien people. He does. He's dealt with them all his life. And the fact that he's like a fish out of water in here, he shouldn't. He should be able to deal with this stuff, and it's that not dealing with how the characters would quote unquote actually exist in this world that really, frustrates me very much. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Nimoy doesn't really care. I mean, he's fine that, Spock has some cool scenes, but Nimoy doesn't care about these other characters because he's just telling the story that he wants to tell, which is fine. It's his prerogative as the director and producer. But no, he's not the director. Sorry. But it feels like he is, because apparently Nick Meyer is sleeping through half of this movie, as he's sort of admitted to before. So it's just a question of what is the responsibility that the movie should have to these characters. I mean, everyone says that he was really upset about David. How come we hadn't heard about David for 2 movies? That's the problem.
So wait, there's another question though.
No, that's a good.
You would hold Star Trek V against Star Trek VI.
Look, these are separate adventures. But
Okay.
certainly Star Trek IV is a continuation of Star Trek III, and Star Trek VI is a continuation of Star Trek IV.
So is this an indictment of Star Trek IV or an indictment of Star Trek VI?
It's an indictment
Don't
of
wait
both.
for the translation. Answer me now.
But I think it's
an
really,
indictment of
if I
both
can just,
because they
I
hadn't
think
set this up.
there's a good, you really raise the central question, which I think is at the heart of our disagreement. It's just, what responsibility do the movies have to sort of be true to the characters as they were established in the series and arguably in motion picture, and what responsibility, or rather what freedom do they have as more having to bridge into the broader popular, movie going audience without losing both, right? And I guess we'd say what we're saying is Star Trek II does that, to your mind, meaning Nick,
Absolutely.
and sort of takes a lot of colloquialism, a lot of Moby Dick, and a lot of things that you could argue are not necessarily things that Kirk or any 23rd century gentleman would be interested in, and uses it to ground and make the characters relatable to a movie audience.
It increases the depth of the interest in these scenes, and it adds to the storytelling, rather than taking a break out of the storytelling to say, oh, look at this funny reference we've just made, which 6 does.
Well, Steve, I want to ask you specifically, you talked about the indulgences of Nick Meyer in Star Trek VI, whereas in Star Trek II, he was famously reined in because he was a young director who only had one movie under his belt. So things like calling the script The Undiscovered Country were not allowed. A lot of the Shakespeare references and Sherlock Holmes, and again, much as we talked about how the actors work in their personal obsessions, Nick works a lot of his obsessions into Star Trek VI, and he was a bigger, more successful director. They were happy to have him, and there was no one there to say no to him. Stephen Charles Joffe was a good friend of his. Ralph was trying to keep the trains running on time, and the studio didn't really understand Star Trek. So my question is, did the fact that Nick, he was thriving on the restrictions of a limited budget, but he was also able to finally do, like, I'm going to call it Undiscovered Country, but you wouldn't let me do it on 2, so I'm going to do it on 6. Was that an advantage, a disadvantage? What do you attribute that to?
Well, I think, first of all, to this day, I still can't believe they managed to call the movie Undiscovered. Like, and I'm not sure necessarily it was the right thing, meaning it is, in a weird way, I applaud the boldness of it, I suppose, and that I certainly had to look it up back then, but I'm not sure that it is of a piece with the rest of the, meaning, like either Dogs of War, there are many other Shakespearean quotes that are referenced in the movie. Again, I'm not knocking the title so much as I'm just baffled by how it all happened in that way. But I think that it's a mix. I think to some degree it allowed the ones that work, only Nixon could go to Vulcan, saying only Nixon could go to China, or even some of the other, allowed an irreverence, perhaps, that I think they had earned in popular culture by this point. But I think it also led to, I'm saying there, I could list the ones that I like and have always liked. I think a lot of Chang's dialogue is fun that way too. I mean, and I do think that you've not heard it until you've heard the original Klingon is pretty good, although the Russian, what's the Chekhov line? It was a little, you're like, okay, how many times are you going to hit that bell? Cinderella, the Russian folktale Cinderella. You're like, okay. It's one thing when the Klingons do it, because that's the joke, is that they've appropriated a part of our culture, and it's so universal that it's, they believe, whether they believe it or not, it's like, that's what they say. So I think it was a mix. I think it helped the sort of tone not be too, sort of pretentioso, I think, which it could have been in terms of trying to kind of go after the political thriller genre. But I think it was also occasionally undermined with things got to have a tailpipe, because you're just, wait, now we're into a colloquialism that just, you can't even, that's not going to survive into the 23rd century. I know Shakespeare will, and I know certain other things, but like that joke isn't going to. So it was, I'd say, a mix, and I'd say overall successful for me, but it is hard to hear some of those zingers today.
Yeah. Well, Darren, you talked about making a joke of Nichelle's Hura with the translation. Is it equally egregious that Walter Koenig's Chekhov is also sort of the butt of the joke? When you have somebody like George Takei gets his own starship and obviously McCoy has some great stuff to do, but Chekhov has, and he said this, he actually prefers Star Trek 5 to Star Trek 6 because he felt he had more to do.
Yeah, because he got to sit in the captain's chair.
Well, he did get to sit in the captain's chair. He got the con
in 5,
but in 6.
But no, his scene in the galley is ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. And the only reason that the investigation is going on and they're doing these things. I mean, gravity boots.
Boots.
There's something called a transporter. You could just transport them into nothingness. But Chekhov being so sure of himself in this situation to stop crewman Dax, and we can. Chekhov would see that he has alien feet.
Now, wait a second. I have
just
to ask you
stupid.
this.
Yeah.
I think we've established on previous podcasts that Chekhov is not exactly the brightest star in the fleet. I mean, let's face it, he didn't understand the photon torpedoes and the phasers in Star Trek: The Motion Picture. He didn't know what planet he was on in Star Trek 2. And you sir, are going to give him a hard time about not recognizing somebody's feet in Star Trek 6?
Yeah, because if he's head of security, which he was on Star Trek: The Motion Picture, then he's an idiot.
Well,
Well, Steve, I want to ask you this, because obviously a lot of this hinges on a murder mystery, and certainly a Knives Out this isn't. There are a lot of coincidences and weird shortcuts it takes, whether it's Captain Kirk recording his captain's log with the door open to his quarters. Was the air conditioning broken? And then of course the gravity boots, which are the crux on which the whole mystery hinges, are found because they're rattling around in a metal cabinet in the very room they're sitting in. So is the murder mystery or the assassination plot at all well reasoned? And that's not budget, is it?
I think parts of it certainly were. I think the idea, first, let's start from the beginning. The notion that there was a bird of prey that could cloak under them that actually took the shot.
Surely not.
Yeah, surely not.
Surely
cloaked?
not.
Sorry, there's another Chekhov. Cloaked. And the idea of someone having to, I was a little confused. I was, even then and now, there's a little bit of like confusion because they changed the logs, but no one actually changed the inventory of the photon torpedoes, which Scotty confirmed. Yeah. But I thought that the idea that there was a plan to frame the Enterprise for the incapacitation of the Klingon ship, and then obviously sort of 2 assassins in Federation gear, beaming over and being seen by enough people to say, okay, those were, Federation people, was enough in terms of the conspirators' plan, which was, I always did wonder, well, how were they going to get, because they needed Kirk and McCoy, Kirk especially, to come over there, meaning that they were either going to, I assume Chang was either going to incapacitate the ship and take them prisoner, but I think Kirk very smartly, and in that great trailer moment, we surrender. But I will say, I loved the idea that he and McCoy both went over there. McCoy, great scene of McCoy trying to keep Gorkon alive. It's actually one of my other favorite moments in the movie. He's pounding on Gorkon's chest, and everybody, like Chang, I actually thought this was a really well covered scene. You have Azet Bur, you have Chang, everyone's like, whoa, like this guy is good. Like, it was really emotional, I thought.
Apparently until the trial, when none of them remember this, apparently.
You were there. Because it was ultimately, I think, it was enough. I always read Azet Bur's thing was just, she couldn't, it was such a huge loss, and the idea that it wasn't them that pulled the trigger, obviously. But getting back to Mark's question, I think that element of the conspiracy was good, and the plan was good. And I like the idea that there was some clue that Spock's a great rack focus shot where it's talked about in the trial, and he says magnetic boots, and then you see Leonard do this. The notion that he was going to kind of bring his Holmesian capacities to this. And he says, whatever must be, they must either the boots or the whoever changed the logs is still here. Whatever we were looking for is still here. Like, it was like actually a very nice audience moment. I don't love that the sort of boots were so sort of randomly discovered. And the idea that like shooting, okay, what happens when you shoot a phaser, the alarm goes off. It was hard to believe that there wasn't another way to dispose of them in a more complete fashion on a starship. So that aspect of it, I think, was not the best. I would agree with that.
And plus, whoever changed the logs could have been one of the assassins that beamed over the Klingon ships. So they weren't.
Aaron, we spent a lot of time talking about how awful Christopher Lloyd is in Star Trek 3, but in Star Trek,
awful, just in a different movie.
Okay, fair enough. So, but in Star Trek 6, you have one of the greatest actors of his generation, Christopher Plummer, as Chang, doing a Moshe Dayan eye patch thing, and he's terrific. How do you have a problem with this incredible character who may be one of the great Klingon performances of any of certainly in the Star Trek motion pictures?
See, I don't think it's a great Klingon performance. I think it's way over the top and way filled with silly Shakespearean sayings. It's the wrong tone. He doesn't feel threatening. He just feels like a maniac, and that's not. That's
interesting. A maniac in that I don't know if I would ever think of him as
Michael Cimbello.
Especially when the Klingons are not involved in the conspiracy. It's like a red herring, to sort of create this totally sort of evil character. I mean, if Klingons like that exist, maybe the Federation is right.
Chang is part of it, doesn't
is
he?
Chang is part of the conspiracy.
Yeah, she says his name when she's
okay. Then that completely skipped by me. So maybe it's a partial.
You should have done this as a commentary. It would have been really entertaining.
Well, and we will again. That's the beauty of it.
Just to sort of press the point. I mean, Mr. Dochterman, you just said that if Chang was indeed part of this, if this is really who he is, then perhaps the Federation, the people in the Federation who felt the way that, say, Admiral Cartwright did, might have had a point.
Yeah.
But given all that, are you then
conceding
that people in the Federation, like Admiral Cartwright, had a point?
Listen, if Chang is involved in the conspiracy, then why on earth would the Federation people trust him to go along with this conspiracy?
Because they do not want, well, I should let Steve answer this. They do not want a rapprochement. They both are united by their disdain for a peace treaty. But the Klingon military-industrial complex doesn't want it. The Federation military-industrial complex doesn't want it. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
See, that doesn't hold water for me. That doesn't hold water at all, because if the Cartwright and the rest of them were so anti-Klingon, they certainly wouldn't treat one of the most Klingon-y of all Klingons himself to go along with this conspiracy. Why would they?
Klingon-y or campy?
Him.
Is he Klingon-y or campy? You before you said he was campy. Now you're saying he's Klingon-y. Is he?
I'm trying to deal with this in universe, Mark.
Okay.
What was the Romulan? Again, it was part of the director's cut. Is a little bit more. I always forget.
Yeah, who was the Romulan representative?
Nanklis.
Yeah, an ambassador.
Part of it as well. And it's figuring out what each of these individuals, because that's how I always read it, was that each of them had enough of a vested interest, which wasn't the same interest, interestingly, for each of them.
Yeah.
in terms of Chang, as far as the what Gorkon represented, like that the political system
The
on
Starfleet
the
industrial
Klingon
complex,
Empire
yeah.
was very different and tenuous in its own way. And you had, Cartwright and the other admirals, they much more existential threat of dismantling starbases along the neutral zone, thus rendering their own capacities moot in a way.
But that
Bill, are we
completely-
talking about
that-
mothballing the Starfleet?
But that
And then-
completely goes against what Cartwright says. Why are we meeting with the Klingons when we should just let them cease to exist?
Because he was
Cartwright's
saying that in the context of that meeting. I mean, with the staff. I don't think he was. I mean, I think he was true to what he was feeling, but I think that's not a rationale for his participation in the conspiracy. I think it was by any means necessary. Each of these conspirators needed to make sure the status quo was preserved, and they all had rationale.
This doesn't hold water for me.
Okay.
Okay, let me ask you guys this. This is a question for both of you. Do either
What
of
happened
you?
to our categories?
Yeah.
You'll come back to the categories. Does either of
Fonts are
these?
important.
We'll get to fonts. Do either of you look at this movie through a different lens now in the wake of the Russian aggression in the Ukraine, given the way that this film was sort of the capper on the Cold War, and basically the message at the end was, wow, isn't this great? If we just work together, we will transcend our differences and everything will be hunky-dory. It certainly didn't foresee a world in which, 40 or 50 years later, the Klingons would become our adversaries again, because
I would, sorry, Darren, I would
No, go ahead.
jump in. I think you'd have to look much earlier than Ukraine to feel sad about the hopefulness that the movie was going for in terms of the promise of perestroika, the promise of the wall coming down, and a democratic Russia, which didn't actually appear in the 90s. And so I'd say what's certainly hard to look at anything in the context of what's going on in Ukraine, which is an absolute human rights catastrophe. But I think even in the 90s, it was clear that not that this was the path that we were going to end up being in this specific place, because I think there was enough to feel like, that conventional wars weren't going to be like that. It was that I think it was just
The end of history.
Sorry,
Is it the end of history? Like as they say in the movie.
It was a little too. I remember sort of thinking about it even in like I said in the 90s, and sort of feeling like there was even then an unfulfilled promise. That there was the oligarchies. There was so much that didn't happen, as often doesn't when countries have to change or forced to change.
I'll go that one further, because I think that the writers and the producers very only basic understanding of the situation, coming from certainly Nicholas Meyer's incredible fear of nuclear war, which is a little bit quaint. Because yeah, of course, because it came from a complete non-understanding of what the Russian situation was, and the furthering of that is that there still is a complete misunderstanding of what the Russian situation is, precisely because of these other aspects to it that no one ever talks about: the oligarchies and the underground and the corruption and all of that. That it's a much more complex subject. That if only there was some kind of touch on that in Star Trek VI.
You got to remember at the time
the political assassination was because I do think that I mean, Rabin was years later, but there was certainly, I think, Gandhi. There was what's it, Sadat? Wait, what am I thinking of?
But remember when Gorbachev disappeared for a week.
Yeah.
And it could have gone either way, and there were all the protests in the street, and then he was released, and basically things quickly fell. Moved towards the end of the Soviet Union and the falling of the wall. But then, even with Yeltsin being the drunk that he was, there was still a hopeful optimism that we would, with McDonald's and American movies, Russia would become a democracy,
and it kept the peace for 30 years.
Except it didn't. So this is what I find fascinating. Now that we're kind of like on this subject, that number one, like those star bases were never taken down along the neutral zone, as it were, with Russia, and that really very quickly, the analogous fears of the Cartwrights of the world were validated by the progress of history in the real world. We don't need to look to the Ukraine. We don't need to look to Georgia. We just need to look to Chechnya, right? Which was merely 8 years later that the Russians first really indulged themselves and bomb the unholy shit out of a city and then move troops into it.
But again,
but at the time, this has nothing to both has everything to do with the film, but also nothing to do with the film, because, and I guess this is me jumping into the argument, but in a world where Star Trek, in its efforts to reflect reality and be allegorical towards reality, if reality bears out a point of view that we don't necessarily like, is it wrong to criticize Star Trek for attempting to capture that reality, for anticipating that reality? Right. It's that,
it's not wrong if your premise is correct. The difference is that supposedly Earth people and the Federation of the Future have gotten past most of this stuff that caused, world wars and things. Supposedly that was the bright future that Star Trek proposes. And none of that is represented in this movie, truly. It's basically taking 90s United States and putting it in the future. And it's appalling.
But how does that square then with how the original series reflected the Cold War and the tensions between the United States and the USSR? Meaning,
the difference is the TV series would always put the analogy with two different societies.
Except it didn't, because when it was dealing with the Klingons, did it not specifically contain references to the United Federation of Planets and its relationship to Klingons, and allegorically be addressing the United States and NATO in the West?
Yes, but even in the first Klingon episode, help me out here.
Errand of Mercy.
No, it was Errand of Mercy.
Errand of Mercy. The Klingons and Kirk respect each other. There's no hatred there. There is the burned in animosity through all the stories about what each other has done, and even that dealt with the fact that what you've been hearing about us is wrong. Okay, there's none of that happens in this. They're all cardboard cutouts.
I don't agree with that, because that's like Eisenhower and Rommel respecting each other. It's not that they like each other; they respect each other's tactics and the way they represent their empire.
It was Patton, but that's okay.
I'm sure Eisenhower respected Rommel too.
I'm sure he did too.
He's perfectly capable of respecting Rommel.
Yeah, look, Eisenhower was Patton's boss, so.
Can I just jump in though? I think because you could also argue, I guess, that the movie, that the 30 years, 25 years that was reflected in the time between younger Kirk, Enterprise, the relationship between the two sides had evolved in a way that was ultimately not great, I guess. And so the everybody living, you're a young person and then you grow up and you become an old person, and you have, and again, even taking David out of it for a minute, because you could, it's low hanging fruit, I guess, when you think of it dramatically speaking, I'd say. And it was, as I said in the beginning, a pretty big justification for the audience to kind of, okay, get it quickly why he said that. I've never trusted them, never will. I just really liked the idea that these were just good, honorable people who've been doing a job for a long time and were able to sort of show a kind of vulnerability in terms of just, I don't know how to like see that another way. I don't know how to see these people. All I've done is ostensibly, if not fight, then oppose them and what they stand for my whole career. And let's just say my whole career included a lot of those 30 years.
Yeah.
And that I'm, as a lot of people get when they get older, and you don't think of yourself that way as a young person, that you're open,
become
and
entrenched. Yeah.
you become entrenched in a way that you are not a different person. You're not, and I think this is where, just to draw a distinction, the bigotry versus the political kind of opposition is important to make. And I agree with you in the sense that it is a bigger leap for me, to your point, and I agree with this, that they would indulge. I kind of buy it, Burke and Sando, I guess, a little bit, but like that the main cast would indulge in the sort of more racist, so even guess who's coming to dinner. I mean, again, I know why Nick does it, because it's a
Right.
fond mot of another movie, and but it is not, or the line that Uhura famously wouldn't say, I think, which
Right.
I think
Right.
is amazing. Was like, oh, would you bring home, what was it like, would you bring one of them home?
Yeah, would you marry one or something?
Would you
like
or would you have what somebody your
Well,
kid
and
loved,
Brock
whatever it
Peters
was.
famously talks about how he had trouble with some of the because the Klingons were clearly stand-ins for African Americans, and that's why they were the racism towards African Americans, which is why they put the spin of having Brock Peters be part of the conspiracy.
Which I actually think, weirdly, I actually love the fact that it was Brock, although of course he was in Thor, and there's that element of it. But I actually thought it did have some significance, and it was ironical, as they say.
Yeah, in a film history kind of thing.
As casting, in a sense, and have him have to present that position. I just whenever it was, I really, like I said, gravitated towards the idea that there were holistic, fundamental, political, human differences, and that but that at the same time, when Azet Ver says, "Listen to yourselves," human, inalienable, like that was really cool. Like she was just like, "Listen to yourselves," like how unaware, unself-aware we can be about these kinds of things. And again, that even with prejudice, even with kind of edging into the casual racism that you might not, it's just when it goes to you're like, come on, like they're not they've been, as Darren, I think I agree with my esteemed colleague across the aisle, they are career Starfleet officers who have met more aliens than anybody ever, and Klingons, and so it wouldn't be about how they smell or how they ate or what they looked like or any of that stuff.
Well,
But
you made an interesting comment about the inalienable, because that conversation really presages a lot of the conversations that are taking place now. So it was kind of prescient, in terms of, how certain words and phrases, have a built-in xenophobic quality or racist quality, or, and that's a debate that's going on now between people of good conscience. But I have to ask you, Steve, because you talk about the fact that, maybe the politics, this goes back to what I was asking about, the resonance of the politics, but ultimately for you, it seems to me that what you're saying is almost that doesn't matter, because the message this is saying at the end is Captain Kirk and the rest of the Enterprise overcome their xenophobia to do the right thing. And that at its heart is Star Trek, at its moral heart.
Well, I think it's both. My hope is that it's both. It's a movie that has characters that transform, and especially poignant because they're characters that we have known and loved and understood for a long time, but also land on the right side of the moral sort of political art aspect, which is hopefully moving the ball forward on equality, on eliminating prejudice, on eliminating, I think, misunderstanding of our enemies, things like that are very much Star Trek. And I guess it is, and this is why these conversations are interesting, because it does get clouded, I think, for a lot of the reasons that Darren's mentioning, particularly the ones that, as I said, are a little bit more low-hanging fruit of sort of bigotry jokes, which are a little uncomfortable, even then. I mean, forget now, like even then. And I think they do hurt the message in that way. But on the plus side, the attempt to even just the dialogue we were just talking about, the listen to yourselves, inalienable human rights, to try to do that, to the ambition to try to take on those issues in an entertaining Star Trek adventure movie is, I guess I have an innate affinity for that attempt, to sort of try to make it a little bit more sophisticated, even as there are other parts of the machine that aren't working. And Darren, again, I really respect you. And so when you bring up these things that are not particularly in the investigation, yeah, I can't be like, no, there's great. Like some of it doesn't work as well. It's true.
Ashley.
That's a related question that gets to kind of how I would assess some of this. When we talk about, for lack of a better term, some of the casual racism that's on display by the cast, by members of the Enterprise crew. And this question is really to both of you. Do you think, from Nick Meyer's point of view as a storyteller in this film, that we as the audience are supposed to believe that that is an okay thing, or that that is a bad thing?
When you say it, just to be clear,
the casual racism, the guest who's coming to dinner, how they smell, how are we?
It's not supposed to be a good thing.
Okay,
Of course it isn't. That's why I have a problem with it coming from some of our main characters.
Well, I think I would answer it slightly differently. It's definitely not, I don't think he was ever meant it to be a good thing, but I do think that it is often telling, what we say is meant to be acceptable as humor or as kind of a joke that is for the, and I think and even again, not even looking at in this moment, which is obviously our moment now, culturally, all, much more, a lot more.
But do you believe that Nick Meyer would agree with you or disagree with you?
I think that Nick wouldn't disagree that he was saying it was okay.
Yeah.
Or yes, I think he would disagree that there was, because I don't think it was conscious. I think in conscious in the sense that he was like, I want people to, this is not a validate. He was never attempting to validate any of those ideas. I'm just saying putting them in the movie as a way of making a joke, which in fairness, I mean, look, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is a very specific movie reference and not like is
to an audience that isn't there.
But it is also, it is a different, I guess you could argue there's some that are offensive just for being completely unbelievable that they would be remembered in the same context as Shakespeare. Yeah. But I think, and I'd say this is true of many movies over many years and many decades, things that we look at and go, okay, certainly not from today's perspective, what passes as a sort of like, well, that's a funny joke, or because again, it's played more, a lot of those beats are played for laughs.
But
I think
you pointed out
not great.
That as it were, like gives the whole speech about human rights, inalienable. Do you hear yourselves? That there is this contrast between sort of the low humor things that you're talking about, and the points that she makes, and some of the other things that we see about Gorkon, that we see even about Chen,
which are great,
right? And I guess for me, and you've answered the question, but I think just to clarify that the question does in fact come down to like reconciling those two things. It is, if it is one thing to be unaware of making those references and you kind of can't believe that they're in the movie, or being very aware that they are in the movie, and as the storyteller disapproving of them, like, would you say that those are two different things? I.e., does making those references, does like the disapproval of the storyteller and Nick Meyer's point of view on those things, does it make a difference in terms of how you interpret?
Let me add, and I want to add something to that to answer as well, which is this. You know, one of the things that really takes me out of those early Bond movies are every time they reference something that's part of the zeitgeist at the time. I'd say one of their aircraft is missing. Oh, I wouldn't, listen to the Beatles without wearing earmuffs, and which really, kind of date the films. Now, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? It's a movie we all know, Stanley Kramer, great cast, Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn. How many people even now really know that movie? So to say 300 years from now, I believe people are still reading Moby Dick. Is anyone going to know, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner?
No one's going to know what a tailpipe is either.
Yeah. Chekhov is not referencing the movie. He's referencing the script. Okay. It is completely not in universe, what he's saying.
And,
it's just there for a joke. And so is Nixon. And no, I guarantee you, no one knows about Nixon now.
Would Star Trek 6, Only Nixon Can Go to China, have been a better title?
So, I think there are other Star Treks right now that use colloquialisms, which we find absolutely appalling. And I think it's only fair to say that, the colloquial English and the references to contemporary things that will not be known in the 23rd century. And I would argue with Darren about Nixon. I think Nixon, that was a significant moment in American history, and it may very well be.
I would argue that line, just on that line of works and could work if it were the only, like in a way, if it were one of the only moments in the sense that it didn't also have Spock saying, my ancestor said, if you eliminate the impossible, whatever's left must be the truth. But it is a wonderful sort of showstopper of a line, I have to say, and I think you forgive it in that sense. It's just
and it makes it the most dated of all the Star Trek movies.
I don't think that's true. I'm not certainly not it
certainly dates back to 1972 when it wasn't made. Oh, sorry.
But also I think in the context of that scene and the story that they were about to tell. But I think to answer your guys' questions, it is definitely, I think it doesn't take how do I say this? It's the movie, we all contain legions, and the movie has parts that work and parts that don't. And it goes back to the earlier thing we said of there was no other countervailing governor regulator to those tonal excursions. And so at the time, and I would imagine, again, showing it to a studio or even a test audience, like anybody's going to gravitate towards like something they know, like, okay, yeah, that sounds good. I know that can relate to that. This was 1991. I mean, it was just like, great, cool. It's Star Trek for everybody. But what's fascinating is in Star Trek 2 and Star Trek 4, I actually think they did the best. They were sort of two versions. Like when he opens up Tale of Two Cities and he says it was the best of times and the worst of times. And he just goes, message Spock. Like he doesn't know it. It was just this like beautiful antique. And we know it because it's Tale of Two Cities. And of course it pays off in the end, but they actually made a point except with, Khan you sort of got because he was older, he'd been around a lot longer. And so the idea that he's quoting Moby Dick, but they actually made a point to make the characters in the movie almost say like, oh, I'm not familiar with this. Let me talk about it for a second and how I'm not familiar. I think that was brilliant. And then in 4, of course, it's having all of the fun with them not understanding any of the colloquialisms of 1986. And so they were actually funny, like they were, as you say, in universe. Whereas in 6, I do think that but for a handful of those, contemporary colloquialisms, they are excursions that don't help the integrity of the movie.
You're not doing yourself any favors here, Steve. I just want you to know
that. You're speaking my lines.
Okay,
I'm just being. I only know how to be honest.
I think his honesty is helping his case.
So let me say this. First of all, I want to say you both have made up to this moment fantastic arguments, both pro and con. I think it's going to be a real interesting conversation. What I want to do now is a lightning round, where I'm going to mention something. I want you to quickly respond to that. Either pro con, articulating your reasons.
Don't wait for the translation.
Yeah, exactly. And then we will do closing statements. But I think this has been probably the most erudite conversation about this movie that's ever taken place or ever will take place. So kudos to you both. Okay, so now we'll start the lightning round first with Darren with visual effects.
Well, you picked the one thing in this movie that is great. The visual effects are, arguably ILM at their peak. They knew how to do space shots. They knew how to light them. They knew how to do explosions. And there were very few visual effects in this movie, save for the explosion of Praxis, which was extremely unbelievable at the time, and was, their brand new plugin that they designed, and it was overused for years to come. But I think that the visual effects are fine in the movie, but I think it doesn't matter that they're fine, because they're just pew 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 space fights. Okay, that's
and
great.
they would be again. That's the beauty of it. They will
That's
use the
correct.
shot again. Steve, what about you? Visual effects.
I also love the visual effects, just like Darren. I will always remember the torpedo shot sort of
going
penetrating the primary hull, which was extraordinary.
Yep.
And I think, interestingly, even though, looking at the Klingon blood now,
That is not Klingon blood.
Which is only in the extended version.
Yes. It was pretty incredible at the time when you realize what they'd obviously been, they'd done The Abyss. Were obviously with T2, but just sort of the movie also. And I would say in that scene, Ralph, you told me some great stories about how they were able to execute the assassination scene, in terms of the combination of practical and visual effects, and using lots of terrific tricks of pulling people back on wires and Klingons, and like that what they were able to accomplish. I know it's only partially a visual effects question, but a very well executed sort of execution. And I think, just again, getting a honest to God space battle in the end, which I think we hadn't seen in a while. And I haven't even gotten a chance to talk about Sulu and the Excelsior, which is a big part of it for me. But
Look, you're doing well. You don't want to ruin it by talking about how much you like the Excelsior.
Let's not have the judges coaching the competitors.
Okay. Well, I
replace the transwarp drive.
Lightning round. Where's the lightning?
Okay, so that was visual effects, and now I got to ask you. We'll start with Steve on this score.
I actually really like the score. I think Cliff Eidelman took a lot of chances. I think that it was it was bold in ways that it's funny because it was near the same year where they where Williams did Last Crusade, and there was a big deal made of how it did not lean on the Raiders thrill button in that score, even though that score is superior in lots of ways, just based on the other themes. But this one, I felt had an appropriately dark, martial tone to it, and yet, sort of I still listen to the sign-off cue because I just love the combination. I love the synthesis of the cue, his rhythms and his musical writing with kind of the flourish of the Courage score, and sort of it being Star Trek. I mean, again, is there a part of me that wishes I had a little more Star Trek in it? Yes, but I also feel like following Goldsmith and Horner was a pretty freaking tall order.
Okay, what about you, Darren? Music score.
Well, you're gonna think that I'm playing for the other team, so to speak, but I like the score too. Apart from the fact that it is extremely repetitive, that the dark sort of Mars theme is repeated way too much all over the movie for no apparent reason.
Well, there was a reason, because he was copying the temp. Because of course the movie was famously Temp with the Planets, which was too expensive to license, and so he kind of knocked it off.
But there's more to it than that. I think that the way that, because Cliff Eidelman was not a film composer, that he did not know how to spot the movie correctly and actually place music where it belonged, and the correct sort of music that went into each of these scenes. So while I enjoy listening to the work, I enjoy listening to the score apart from the film, and I enjoyed it at the time. I think that it's not a good film score. It's a good piece of music. It's not a good film score.
We love that trailer score, or that
Absolutely.
trailer cue. Though.
Absolutely.
By the way-
In our guides and our companions.
Well, no, that was different. That wasn't in there. That was the teaser.
Yeah, and they used footage from the original series, which made it even
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
By the way, I forgot to mention when you were talking about visual effects. Of course, you know, Ralph, I'm sure told you why the Klingon blood was pink.
Because they love pink, because it was Wednesday.
Because they didn't want to get an R rating if they made it
Right.
red.
Oh, right.
And so, and they needed something that would show up.
Everybody loves kaopectate.
And
Let's
they
make
needed,
it look like that.
And it couldn't be green because
If you
Vulcan
don't
blood
bleed
was
pink,
green.
you can't sit with us.
And they couldn't make it black because it wouldn't show up. So
Right.
it would kind of limited what they could do. And that's why it's that pink purple kind of thing, which you think, wow, that's Klingon blood. Okay.
Okay.
But, okay. So that brings us in our lightning round. One more subject.
Lois?
Fonts.
I like pink very much.
Fonts.
We're not going
Fonts.
to talk about fonts.
Of course we are. Of course we are. Because not only are there fonts in the opening credit, but there are also the graphics, which are so much better than Star Trek 3. I think Mike Okuda worked on this one.
Yeah, he did. And
Yeah,
with
and-
Zimmerman, and they did a lot of work on little tiny, I mean, Okuda tells some great stories of him, you know, writing out the whole or torpedo instructions, and then
Yeah.
Nimoy found a spelling mistake on the set and made him go redo it. I thought there was a sorry.
Well,
Darren,
it kind of shows you how Nimoy's attention was completely
Oh.
misguided.
Dun dun dun. I will say I think I'm not a fan of the credit fonts. I think that was
Very purple.
very purple and a very strange adaptation of previous title fonts, but not one that I felt worked. But I loved I guess you'd say the fonts or the design of the graphical design of the movie in terms of the making the Enterprise seem even more submarine-like in its car. They made the corridors smaller, I guess. I read that at some point where Herman made they made it I guess more stainless steel, like more. I guess the corridors were some kind of brushed metal more than I guess they were, but that they also, even the way it was lit more than he did with 2, sort of had that submarine-y feel. But I know I'm just talking about the fact that
It's only because at this point they were cladding on the set inside the existing Next Generation sets.
right.
So of course they
I
had
feel
to be
like
smaller.
Donnie, I'm out of my element here. I feel like I'm floundering
No, look,
a little
look,
bit.
I
like the pictures. I like the graphics.
I have no argument about that. I think that what my problems with this film do not have anything to do with the graphics or the overly sappy signatures at the end.
Which originally, of course, was supposed to be the characters signing the logbook, but then the cast revolted and demanded it be the actors,
Which is
which
ludicrous.
makes no sense. Okay.
None at all.
Now, Ashley, we come to you. Before these two fine gentlemen make their closing statements, you have a chance to ask one final question before we move on to the closing statements.
One last adventure.
For each of them.
Steve Asbell,
Captain.
do you hear the chimes at midnight? Steve?
Cry Havoc.
Okay, thank you.
Wait, is that actually?
Well, you know what, actually, I think that guy who didn't like you and wants you off the show, I think he's going to change his mind after this episode.
I think he totally is.
Not from that question.
Yeah, yeah, okay, yeah, that's my
Was the
question.
question if
Steve.
I
What would
actually
you have
do
to
hear the
say to
chimes
that
in
guy
It's
who
only
doesn't like
10:30.
me
It's
in
probably
the
midnight
comments?
where you are.
That's funny. He's in an undisclosed location in the Midwest. We're not going
An
to say
undiscovered
what
location.
state.
He's in an undiscovered country.
He's in an undiscovered country.
Whoa.
Wow,
Exactly.
that's the way homer. You only get it on the way home.
You have
I know it
You
is.
should have quit
So
when you were
I've actually
ahead.
got like a question that for each of you that will require you
Bonus
to switch sides just a little bit. So to
Ah.
Steve, tell me what you think is the the great weakness of Star Trek 6. It can be something that you feel like you learned in this podcast or not. And then Darren, tell me what you think is the great strength of this film. And it could be something that that you've come to in the course of this podcast and the conversation with Steve.
Great
Well,
question.
I'll go first to give Darren. Darren's going to need a moment to think about that, what he likes, what he might like about it. I think for me, the things that I think it is the murder mystery, I guess, and the fact that there were, as is often, you're only as good as your weakest link in that. And there were, in listening to this, I think there are a few that are very easily explicable, or at least would have been much more easily dealt with in a 23rd century story, in terms of the boots, in terms of like the parts that I gloss, because I like the element of the ship, that the torpedoes came from a different direction, and that that there was a sort of very clear fake out that you were meant to believe the Enterprise fired on Corkin's ship was awesome. And the idea that they needed to get Kirk in particular, who had long been, I believe, an enemy of the state in a way, sort of.
There could be no peace as long as Kirk lives.
As long as Kirk lives. Same ambassador, right?
John Shuck, yeah.
Yeah.
Holmes and Yo-Yo.
Yeah.
He was Yo-Yo.
And I would say I really like the sort of notion of I love Spock being a captain and sort of actually being a captain on the ship.
Wait a second, you're
These are
supposed to be
things
talking.
that don't work.
No. But I'm saying I think the problem is the actual solution and conversation about the boots and about they don't really, it doesn't really add up, I guess, in a way that is as satisfying, because it argues that the conspirators are smart enough to do all of that other stuff, but not smart enough to figure out how to dispose of the one.
And in the end, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all, the outcome of their discoveries.
Okay.
The outcome of discovery does not matter. Yes.
I gotta tell you, I'm amazed that no one brought up the Meridian patch. In a world where you would have like nanites in people's bloodstreams or some kind of microscope.
Best part is it's just on his jacket the entire time.
That was part of my closing argument.
Thank
you very much.
Sorry. Okay. So let's go to Darren. What do you like about Star Trek 6, as Ashley asked?
Look, I don't hate this movie. I enjoy watching these actors in a big movie. I enjoy watching them act and do their thing. Even though I don't agree with what they're doing 80% of the time, I love seeing Shatner do his thing, and I love seeing them on the Enterprise. I enjoy the space views. The view at the end of the Enterprise going, out into the sunset is beautiful and brings tears to my eyes. It's a wonderful emotional thing, and I can forgive a lot of the crap that's in the movie. So it's a lovely mixture of things that I don't really like, but it's tolerable for me.
Okay, thank you for that, Ashley. Thank you for some fine questions. And I think now, since Darren delivered the original opening statement second, we're going to give him the chance to do the closing statement first, and then Steve can rebut with his closing statement. And then Ashley and I will determine who is the winner of this great debate.
All right, I'd be glad to. In closing, I just want to say that while the goals of this film are laudable and correct, the methods they use are lazy, clumsy, and not well thought out. I think that it would be an incredibly better entertainment if we actually considered that these characters are people from the 23rd century, and coming up with ways that 23rd century people would deal with this would be great. It's a question of why do we have to go through this horribly cloddy mystery that, as I pointed out before, really doesn't have any basis on the outcome of the film. It's very sad to me that we're wasting time in this prison planet where it's just it's just a distraction from the rest of the movie. And nothing really happens on it. It's just a way to separate Kirk and McCoy from the rest of the story, to keep them from solving the mystery. And it doesn't add up to me. I think the prison planet is really not good. It's full of cliche and science fiction laziness and things that Captain Kirk would have been familiar with. Certainly shapeshifters. He's dealt with at least 2 of them in the past. So it's things like that that just make me think that it was really thrown together with no consideration of what they were actually writing. And that just, that, for lack of a better term, irks me. Captain Irk.
Okay, well, thank you, Darren. That was very well articulated, arguing the con of Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, and why it's not a good Star Trek movie. Now we turn to closing statements to Steve Asbell and why Star Trek VI is a Trek triumph.
Star Trek VI is an incredible final story, in at least, as it was presented, kind of covering the 25 years of these characters and being able to at least look at actually consider the time and the space and the lives and the histories, and make use of those, not just those characters and their histories as their narrative histories from the canon of the show, but our histories with them. And the fact that the movie was able to look back and as discussed, at the relationship between these characters, the humans, and an original enemy of our heroes, the Klingons, from early, they weren't. It wasn't a new enemy that they decided to come up with for the last story, a new thing to finally have to face. It was kind of going back to the original adversaries and making dramatic hay out of the not just the conflict as we knew it, but how it had evolved in a way that, as we've talked about, reflected in some ways how our own relationship with those same enemies had evolved, and how we made I believe an entertaining adventure which took the characters off the ship, put them on the ship, took them off the ship, which is unusual, put them back on the ship, and then ended with a sort of a two-track story of the space battle in around Khitomer, and then stopping the assassination attempt itself. That there was a full movie in there. There was a full adventure story that also made an effort, and I think mostly successfully, as we've discussed, to not just comment on the moment in history of perestroika and of the bringing the wall down and what we'd hoped for beyond, but like I said, actually giving these characters a real sense of history. And I have to say, I don't want to ruin my curve here, but I loved Sulu finally getting to be a captain. I loved that sense of one of them had kind of finally grown up beyond, sitting at the helm, and actually had his own command. And that sense that, it's funny when you're not half as big as their captain, I think, but that idea that one of the kids would go on, but then come back to make sure that he could help, his friends save the day, like those aspects of growth, which I feel like were a purview of the films in a way, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, that you couldn't necessarily, you certainly weren't going to do it with these characters in the show because the show was 25 years before, but that they actually made so much use of their history and allowed them to be older and made that a dramatic point in the context of this entertaining sort of, adventure movie, was pretty special. And to do it at the 25th anniversary of the show, and as Next Generation was taking off, and it sort of gave them, I think, a very fine send-off. And as we've talked about, I think there are things that were a bridge too far in some of the details. And I think some of Nick Meyer's tendencies towards his own version of it, things that he finds funny that perhaps others might not, were never contained, or were never curtailed, rather. It still is, I think, a really fine and poignant story between, and we didn't even talk about this, but Kirk and Spock and McCoy kind of, again, being together, and the idea that Spock, I know it's a sub theme, that Spock was going to save them, that this time they were stuck in a prison for the rest of their lives, and he'd been dead before, and he's going to go get them. That it actually had those same, I think, through lines of friendship, and it never lost track of their relationship, even as it in the beginning created a conflict between Kirk and Spock that was used to illustrate Kirk's bias. And it continued, far be it for me to dispute, to whatever he says, my first officer, like it snaps at him. Like it is, they have to heal that in a way. It's a sub story in the movie, but that it was still in the great tradition of the film. I say this is the last thing I'll say, which is what we love, I think, certainly what I love about the movies, as I said at the beginning, is that somehow they capture those characters in ways that are, I think, again, we can debate how closely or not they hew to the versions of them from the 60s in the show. Very reasonably debate. I'm not saying they do or don't. I'm saying it's a very reasonable thing to talk about, but that they're very cinematic, and they're very large, and and the themes and the sacrifice. It's the things that I do still love about Star Trek 3, the sort of passion of it, of their friendship and their relationships. I think that still shines through in a movie that is arguably busier than the other entries, which are far more about their own. That's the interesting thing. It's like 3, 4, certainly 2. They're very much just about, it's a low stakes. They're of their own stories and
interturmoil.
And going to save Spock, and then yes, it's kind of about the whales, but it's really about will they get home. This one is like they're sort of participants in a way of a thing that's kind of happening around them, which is unusual, and I think in a really interesting way for a Star Trek movie. But I don't think it ever supersedes those dynamics. And again, the pleasures of seeing them again after that many years, and also in acknowledgement that this was it for them. And it really was, other than the brief opening of Generations with a couple of them, it like many things that never stayed dead in our current culture, like this was it. And I think it was a very, very fine send-off. And I think that's why it's really still quite powerful for me.
Well, gentlemen, that was extraordinary on both. Well done for both of you. It does seem that Ashley and I have quite a lot of deliberating to do to evaluate. And I wonder if perhaps now is not the time to do it. If we should either, what? Darren shaking his head.
You got to come up with a decision.
Oh, I don't know. I thought maybe we have to go into our judges' chambers and talk
Dark
about
chamber.
the merits of the arguments, and maybe record an addendum to this podcast that we would put on, or leave it to our listeners. But after seeing their response to the poll of greatest Star Trek seasons, where Star Trek season 2 was not winning in a rout, I question their judgment. Ashley, what do you think after hearing the arguments by these gentlemen about the merits and lack thereof of Star Trek 2?
Let's dispense with some of the gimmies. So first of all, I think we can agree that the fonts generally were an improvement, with a couple of exceptions. I think that we can agree that Cliff Idleman did a fine job, that at times his inexperience as a feature composer were apparent. But the music was never bad, and I would say I'm not convinced that the music was ever exactly wrong. Just I do think that DAREN effectively makes a point that at times it was improperly spotted, which I think is less about Cliff Idleman and more about Nick Meyer, kind of controlling that process. I think that we can all agree that the visual effects are great. Certainly, I think that they made the case that the return of cool space battles was welcome. That the photon torpedo blasting through the primary hull was a great moment in sports. I think we can all go with that. And now it comes down to the more difficult things. I would say that I don't know that the overall assessment of the performances is necessarily something that is in large dispute, at least relative to kind of what they would be in almost any other Star Trek film.
I gotta say, Ashley, I was surprised that they didn't spend more time on the performances as well. There was an area mention of the performance, the wonderful performance by W. Morgan Shepherd. Yep. There was no mention. Christopher Plummer was briefly discussed, I think only because I brought it up. There was Rosanna DeSoto. There were a bunch of performances, and I think even as much as we talked a little bit about the racism of Captain Kirk, there wasn't much discussion about Shatner's performance in this, which is quite good. Given particularly how it was not one of the stronger things in Star Trek V. As much as we like that movie, Shatner's performance was not one of the great things, because I think without a strong hand directing him, he wasn't as effective. So that was interesting. They chose not to explore that. I was also surprised that it wasn't until very late in the discussion that Steve brought up the virtuoso action sequence of the assassination sequence, which is such a strong part of the movie, which he sort of glossed over. Which I would have led with much earlier.
Right? I feel like I amount of time talking about it, but that's just me. I'm biased.
Given all of that, I mean, I think that, as we're kind of assessing debate points here, that the fact that when those things did come up, they came up positively, kind of shifts those things into the positive column. I mean, I think that were they in the negative, I think that we might have had a larger discussion about them, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But I mean, I think that here's where I'm like most convinced by DAREN. Yeah. To kind of give DAREN his due. Give the DAREN his due.
Yeah, you have to give him his due, because he really went for the jugular with the murder mystery plot, and he had Steve on the ropes, because Steve was acknowledging how effective DAREN's argument was, that the murder mystery did not work, that this was sort of unfulfilled promise, and that it was, you really had to overlook how ham-fisted it was. So I points to DAREN on that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that he's right. It doesn't work. That that at times it's very convenient, and I think that Steve kind of made the most damning argument about it, which is that there are elements of that mystery aboard the Enterprise that seem in conflict in terms of how it represents the intelligence of the people who are a part of the conspiracy, that they can make the rest of it feel so effective, but it feels so ineffective in the small details that doesn't work. And while I respect where DAREN is coming from on what the characters may or may not do, what I don't know that DAREN escaped was a feeling that it was that what he was making was an assertion about how they would act as a matter of taste versus a matter of course, and didn't truly answer the question of what was the conflict that would sit in replacement of the feelings of the crew, even putting aside the casual racism argument. What would sort of sit in place of that feeling about the Klingons that would drive the movie forward in an interesting and kind of emotional way? I just don't know that argument was made.
To be fair, the assignment was not to rewrite the movie.
Well, yes, that's very true. Yes, exactly. The assignment was not to rewrite the movie, but I don't know that that DAREN effectively knocked that plank out from underneath the movie, because I found that effective. And look, I had my mind open to like make the case for me that wasn't the way to go. But I think that Steve actually very effectively made the argument that using David's death and the experiences these characters had and how they had aged. And, look, I kept coming back to it. We never really got into it, but there's a critical scene that we never really talked about that was Spock and Kirk, and they're, in Kirk's quarters, and it's just before the big fight, right? And Spock says, have
Spock's
we
quarters,
two...
actually.
Okay, it's Spock's quarters.
That's fine.
Okay, we're getting technical. It's the Inglorious Treksperts.
That
It's
constitute
it's Mariner Burgess's quarters,
Indeed.
designed by Tim Butterman.
Have we grown so old and inflexible? Yeah.
Yeah, that we constitute a joke, right? And it's like,
and then he just goes, "Come on, I need you to do cut." That's another issue.
It gets to the theme of the film, and I don't know that. I think that Steve made a very effective case for that. And I think overall, I mean, I think that this debate has kind of come down into the column of recommend, while conceding like that there are elements of the plot, like, and there are elements of Nick Meyer's choices as a director, as a storyteller, where he needed somebody to tell him no, that he was not told no. Like, those things are very much apparent, and they're there. But in the grand scheme of things, I have to give the edge to Steve, while conceding the validity of many of DAREN's arguments.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I felt that DAREN came out much stronger on the top. I think in his opening statements, he really came out swinging, and he had a very effective argument. And I think it was very easy to kind of pull the string on everything that doesn't work. In a way, as much as this is a beloved movie, I think Steve had the harder job, because there's so much you can, on paper, say doesn't work about this movie. And I felt that what Steve did in his closing statement is he really brought the disparate arguments together. He highlighted the idea of this in the way that Star Trek 3 was about friendship, about Captain Kirk sacrificing everything to help his friend. Star Trek 6 inverts it, where Spock makes the sacrifice to help his friend, Captain Kirk. I think that he also pointed out the fact that this really is a capper. It's a bookend on the Star Trek movie franchise, and very effectively and emotionally delivers on the promise of this being the final mission of the original Star Trek crew, which it turned out to be. I think that where Steve really didn't have an argument, and DAREN certainly triumphs, is Meyer's indulgences. And there's not a good response to that, because clearly it is overindulgent, and there was no one reining in Nick Meyer.
I actually agreed. Like I said, I'm no stranger.
You are unanimous.
But I think the most subjective stuff is when DAREN says this isn't Star Trek, which is the old Roddenberry argument. How much. How elastic is the Star Trek formula? I mean, it's certainly okay to say, yeah, they're xenophobic. DAREN found that objectionable. The racism even more so of this crew. And at the time, it was quite surprising to see the Star Trek characters. But it is. But then Steve would say, "Oh, but isn't it interesting to use this mythology they've established with Star Trek 3, where the Klingons killed his son? So really." Kirk is really the only one you could do this with, because he suffered this devastating loss. And you could understand why he would have this issue with the Klingons. So for me, it was very close. I think they both did a really magnificent job in articulating their respective views. But I have to, and again, I am somewhat biased. DAREN said at the top of the show, I am somewhat biased because I do like this movie. despite its flaws. And I think, Darren went into it knowing already that we liked the movie, and he did the best possible job at tearing it down. But I have to give the advantage because I think, particularly in his closing statement, Steve really brought it home.
I just want to throw in one last thing, which is about the crew's attitudes, and kind of put aside like how that drives kind of the emotional conflict in the movie. I asked the question about, what do you think Nick Meyer wants us to think about the crew's attitudes, and does he have an opinion on it?
And they love Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, the fact that he does want us to have an opinion on it, that he clearly doesn't approve of it, that the characters do in fact come around to a different point of view, tells us everything about his intentions as a storyteller. And that I think that the fact that at the end of the day, right, that Captain Kirk realizes the problem with his bias, with his prejudice, that everybody in some way, like Scotty, right? Like, I mean, look, all he has to do is kick down a door and shoot a Klingon. But it's everybody comes around.
Although
to one degree or another. Well, that's true, actually. Very good point.
Yeah.
Everybody comes around, and I think that that's a critical piece for me. That was actually a very important question for me. So yeah.
Well, the fact that Captain Kirk can accept his inherent biases makes it very of the moment, whereas you're right, some of the politics of it are much more dated. But I think it was very close. I think they both did an extraordinary job articulating their respective points. Yep. I think that this is hopefully a really great show, and I'll be very much looking forward to the feedback, because I'm sure Darren will have a ton of supporters, as will Steve, and it'll be very interesting to hear what they all have to say.
Well, I graciously accept defeat in this instance, because I had a worthy rival, and I accept this in the spirit that it's given, and that it was a 3-1 against me. So that's fine.
I would say thank you for that, but I would say I've won nothing except that card because first of all, Darren, I have as a guest as a fan of the podcast, but I always say the fact that I'm even here is always funny to me, because I'm just a schmuck who likes Star Trek and listens to the show. I have enormous gigantic respect for you as a fan. I mean, everything. I'm here because of what you say on the show, and you're I think extremely thoughtful, but also as a creative person, somebody who works in business. Like I agree with you all. I'm not like, yeah. Darren tells the truth. Like I always feel like there's a lot of both love and passion, but also great
gratitude and joy,
but acuity and precision and sort of real, like, it's a real conversation. And so I was joking when I say I kicked the ball into my own goal. Like, I actually think this is the fun part, is being able to, like we said about Star Trek 3, engender a discussion that is both, we're all fans and love all of it, but when do you get the chance to kind of interrogate all this and be like, oh, wow, no, I hadn't thought about it that way. And what better thing can we say in the world right now that we're talking about with people where we can disagree and actually learn to look at something in a different way, which seems in short supply. I know that's maybe cheesy to say, but it is true.
That's what Star Trek.
I thank you for those kind words, and I really appreciate you for saying them and being a wonderful guest as always.
I will just say, Steve, you would have had a much harder time had this been Star Trek 3 and you were defending Star Trek 3.
No, I would just be telling Rob about his shot choices and his lenses. No, which were all true. I mean, his idea, and I'm sure it wasn't the first, he wasn't the first to say it, but when he said, well, why don't you start the movie with Valkyries and the Klingon shuttle? And I was like, wow. I was like, wow.
Yeah, development executive.
That's cool. I might have done that. That's wild. No, but, I mean, these are also things that these are all, like I said, for me, they're a part-time capsule of when they came out and the context of how it was made and all the stuff, again, that you guys talk about so much in the show about, in this case, the 25th anniversary of the show, like what the studio was thinking, what were they going to do? And they had gone through the shit with the Starfleet Academy and broken with Harv, which I'm sure was a thing, and Ralph, and then you had the cast, and you had everybody sort of had to get paid, I'm sure, to come back, and it was, and then
There
it
was
was,
smaller budget than Star Trek 5.
is this
Yeah.
really going to be the last one? Look at these upstarts on the show, and yeah, I still would love. I don't know that it would have ever worked pacing wise, but the finding them all where they were, who are teaching, and Scotty with this thing, like it probably would never have worked. But I was like, that's why I love the novelization so much. I have a real soft spot for all the J.M. Dillard books.
Look,
Even though
I wish I had seen the movie that you did, honestly.
Yeah. Fair enough.
I think this is a good format for future discussions of some of the movies too.
We should return again to this place.
Because we do have a generations discussion coming up with Brian.
But
Ford
who's going to be
Sullivan.
on the other side?
Yeah,
Well,
I'm
no,
not sure
Bri-
you
Bri-
want me on that one.
Right. Brian Ford Sullivan is going to be defending Generations. He's
Wow.
the futon critic and a writer for TV now with shows like Arrow. And he came up to me at the Skirball, and I know Brian's been on our panels at Comic-Con in the past, and he was like, I really want to go at you guys for Generations. I'm a fan. And I'm like, why?
God bless
Because it's there.
America. I don't know. Okay. I can't wait for that.
Yeah, I know. It should be fascinating.
That's a word.
I don't know who could make an argument that there's anything worthwhile about it. But this got me into problem years ago, so I'm not even gonna, I'm not gonna go there. It's just
I can't wait for the Nemesis episode.
but
You guys have like, I believe there's a nemesis that could have been.
Actually, no, I
made.
actually
No,
I do
that's
think
Ashley
there's a
who keeps
Nemesis that
saying
can-
that.
But that
I'm
it totally
fascinated
depends
by that.
on the
Yeah, I'm with you,
deleted scenes
Steve.
and a
I
re-edit.
tried to watch it a number of times, and I mean,
It doesn't get any better.
it's hard. Once I think you do have to, and I know you guys have talked about this, really, you got to look at them as different series of movies in a way. And I would say 1 through 6 and then Generations through Nemesis are as we talked about with Insurrection. I mean, just the world was different. The way in which they were still on the show, or not, not long after the show, rather, in that case, was different. And how much the original cast movies, benefited from being so many years later from the show. And got to have their own movie series.
They had more heft, didn't they? It was more like Mount Rushmore. It was like more like there was something more substantial about them. I think because all this time had passed. With Star Trek Next Generation movies, it felt like, oh yeah, these are the guys from TV.
It's another episode. I mean, they all
It's
felt
another
like they had episodic concepts for the most part. I mean, you could argue First Contact was a more movie worthy idea, I suppose, but certainly Insurrection, as we talked about, was as episodic a concept as you could imagine, with very little growth in the part of the characters. I remember when I was in college, and it was like, okay, First Contact was coming out, I was like, oh, I wonder if Riker and Troy are going to get married. Like, I wanted to see kind of the similar growth that we're talking about, like from these younger cast, and like they were obviously very different from the original series actors, but the idea that they were all going off in different directions, that was always the promise of the movie series, was that they would be much more sort of character based, and the events of their life. We learned anything from these other movies that they were, interestingly, with the exception of how we're talking about 6 in a sense, although it was, other than being the last one, they were really big events in their lives in a way, and the stories were a function of that, as opposed to Insurrection. They go and there's a thing that makes him act a certain way, and he's gonna go against the thing, that they could never escape the gravity well of those kind of like, well, that's fine. Like,
Honestly, I think we should reopen this in another episode, because
we're going crazy.
I'm drifting.
You're gonna have to cut all this anyway.
No.
Well, Steve's arguments aren't compelling enough for you.
Not at this time.
No, I can do this all, because I'm a guest. I could just do this all day. You guys
Yes.
I agree. We can return to this. I think what's so fascinating, guys, is the fact that we could spend 2+ hours talking about whether you love or loathe this movie, that there's enough there to explore it in this kind of depth after all these years, which you can't say about a lot of Star Trek past a certain point in its existence. And I think that's one of the reasons we keep coming back. It's like Kirk says, well, we must revisit this place again. Well, we're revisiting these places in Star Trek history again and again and again. And every time we turn over a rock or find a Vulcan burial ground, there's something new to explore. So it's very exciting. We're so glad that you joined us for this conversation. I hope that our listeners will embrace it as much as we did. And like I said, there are no losers here, only winners. So thank you, Steve, for joining us. Thank you, Darren, for being such a good sport, and Ashley for putting on
Whatever the hell it was, I did.
referee stripes. You really, have the shorts, the shirt, and everything.
Staying up late.
And
Kid.
staying up late. But we'll be back next week with an all new episode of Inglorious Treksperts. We want to thank Mark Rivera, Bill Ritter, our producers, Natalie Miscali, and Peter Holstrom and Zach Raggis. Encourage you to continue the conversation and let us know your thoughts about Star Trek 6 on our social channels, which include Twitter at Inglorious Trek, Instagram at Inglorious Treksperts, and of course the entirely different Twitter feed at Treksperts BR for Treksperts Briefing Room and Treksperts Briefing Room at Instagram, as well as on Facebook, where you can follow us and share your thoughts and grow stronger through the sharing. So until next week, on behalf of Steve, Ashley, Darren, and myself, Mark A. Altman, keep on trekking, and gloriously, of course. And now everybody sign the log.
Do-do-do-do.